Hello again. I'm David Wilkins, and this is the eighth in our series of 8 classes in American slavery. I want to thank you for being with us for these 8 sessions. I want to conclude today, beginning with a summary of what we've learned, conclude with the role that enslaved men and women played in the Civil War and the emancipation period afterwards. So let's begin. Let me share my slides. We'll do a brief summary of the ground we've covered and get into our last segment on that era between 1850 and 1860. So when we began several weeks ago, looking at American slavery, what can American slavery teach us today? What are the legacies of slavery that continue to be a challenge to our 21st century American society, global society indeed? We focused on the materials from Teaching Tolerance Project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Teaching Hard History. Again, I commend that material to you, both the podcast as well as the programs developed for teachers, and you'll find that link at tolerance.org. It is excellent. We talked quite a bit about the New York Times' 1619 Project, the 400-year commemoration of the first Africans sold into the colonies that would become the United States. Looked at the excellent work done by the project team and the controversy that had arisen as a result of the publication of that work. Hannah Nicole Jones, Pulitzer Prize winning awardee for her first segment of that project, continues to be the focus of great attention. Again, I commend that project and its work and the curriculum that's developed as a result of it, for your students if you're teachers, for yourself if you're simply a consumer of this very, very important history. Slavery in antiquity. We established, I hope, pretty clearly that the practice of slavery has existed from the beginning of time. All societies engaged in enslaving people. In most instances, it were people who were captured as a result of a war, who were imprisoned for some crime, or who were poor and simply victims of the circumstance. The unique characteristic of American slavery, as we would come to know in class 2 and 3, is the hereditary nature of that slavery, the fact that the children of enslaved women would become enslaved, and that slavery would be perpetual. And then the racial characterization, or the racial character, I should say, of American slavery really distinguishes it from the other forms of slavery in the ancient world. We then moved to class 2, where we continue to explore how slavery in America would evolve, the origins of racism, again, the unique character of American slavery. Obviously, we needed to bring in the European exploration, the Spanish, the French, ultimately the British, and their exploitation of the New World. So obviously Columbus and the Portuguese, I should also include, coming from the Atlantic, across the Atlantic, making forays into the Americas. Their contact with indigenous populations, both in North and Central and South America, would have, and the Caribbean, would have cataclysmic impacts for those cultures. The Europeans' search, desire for gold and for profit would create simply enormous impacts on these societies that would continue through our American experience with the enslavement of first indigenous people and then with Africans. Quickly moving then to the transatlantic slave trade, again, that trade that would begin on the west coast of Africa in the Iberian Peninsula and move west to the Caribbean, to again the North and Central Americas. We made the point that most of the Africans who were brought from Africa would end up in South America, Brazil primarily. And then the next largest number would be sold and enslaved in the Caribbean, and only about 500,000 would make their way to what is today the United States. We had several segments on the Middle Passage, again, that horrendous voyage between the African coast to the New World. Estimated 12.5 million Africans made that passage, 2 million or more dying even before leaving or en route. In our third class, we took Ira Berlin's construction of the charter generation and the plantation generation, and then ultimately the revolutionary generation, as a way to frame both the time frame as well as the kind of slavery that would be played out in the American experience. Again, that charter generation, that first generation of the Atlantic Creoles, primarily, some of whom traveled with the conquistadors, others simply finding their way to this new world as ultimately enslaved men and women. Plantation generation would be that next era, the next 150 years, where indeed the plantation system would be established in the US, particularly in the 19th century, the early 19th century in the South, with the well-established cotton plantation society. And then the revolutionary generation, which we would see before and during and after the Revolutionary War. We focus on Bacon's Rebellion for its very important message that indeed slavery in America was going to be race-based, and that race base needed to separate or distinguish, really exclude poor whites. In other words, Bacon taught the established oligarchs that in order to be successful, there could be no alliance between poor blacks and poor whites. And therefore you create this hierarchy where poor whites were always going to be treated better than both free people of color and enslaved people, ensuring, of course, that the powers that be would be able to rely on the small tokens of superiority, if you will, given to poor whites, and always positioning them against poor blacks to prevent, again, the alliance that was threatened by Bacon in his rebellion against the colony. We focused as much as we could on the role of the Spanish. We mentioned the Portuguese, but the Spanish in Florida, control of Florida, and the tension really that was created as Florida would welcome enslaved Africans who were able to escape from Georgia, move into Florida, establish communities. We considered the Maroons, the Angola Maroon community that we know existed in Bradenton, which is still being excavated. And so these Maroons would be a force to be dealt with throughout the late 17th, 18th century, 19th century, as you find groups of escaped Africans allying themselves with native peoples like the Seminoles and presenting a challenge to the established white authorities in the early colonies. The Stono Rebellion was one of the earliest examples of an attempted slave rebellion, not successful. None of them were as successful as the Haitian Revolution, which we will examine in a moment. But there was always resistance, and we tried to make that point throughout these seven, now eight classes, that enslaved people, men, women, and children, resisted their enslavement in many, many ways. Open rebellion was less frequent, but an ever-present threat. What resistance in the way of stopping work, running away, teaching oneself to read, using that education as a way, again, to gain, obtain your freedom. It is again, a recurrent theme, an important message that we must teach when we talk about American slavery and the role that enslaved people played in gaining their own freedom. The Revolutionary generation, the age of enlightenment, and the fact that the colonists insisted that they must be free from the tyranny of the British, as we learned, provided a language for free people of color and enslaved people to insist on their own freedom and their demands for freedom, which we would see then played out in petitions made by the Black community to the colonial governments at the same time as war was being made with the British. We get to the Revolutionary War in Class 4, and we find people of African descent fighting for both the British and for the Patriots. In both instances, the calculation was, how can I gain my freedom? The British were, as we learned, Lord Dunsmore's proclamation, which promised freedom to any enslaved person or person of color who chose to fight for the British. And we would see ultimately 3,000 to 4,000 people of color leave the colonies after the British are defeated and would move to Canada and start new lives. Those African Americans who chose to fight for the Patriots would gain their freedom in some instances, and in other instances they would not. And so again, a tension that would obviously persist after the war and the establishment of the new Constitution, the new nation. We looked at the Constitution and its protections for slavery. We looked at the particular clauses, particularly the 3/5 clause, the clause that provided for the potential that the slave trade would end by 1808, and the Fugitive Slave Clause. All of these will be played out again as we proceed. And so again, just a quick summary. Class 5, that period after the revolution, the new nation, and we see how the nation is going to grow demographically and geographically, and we see the increasing wealth being gained in the South as slavery would become a economic powerhouse for the enslavers. Certainly after the cotton gin, the emergence of the cotton industry. But again, we see other instances in Class 5 of Black resistance and attempts of revolts. We'll look again at those as we get into Class 6. The Haitian Revolution, critically important event. Both the opportunity for the second democracy in the New World, a democracy led by the revolting, rebellious Haitians, who would be the first Black democracy in the world, in the New World at that time. In class 6, we again focused on the Haitian Revolution as the best example of a successful rebellion, and an event that would, in the minds of the white enslavers, create a perpetual concern that a similar rebellion could occur in the new nation. There were some attempts, the German Coast Rebellion. We looked at Denmark Vesey, and the Seminole Wars. Again, the Black Seminoles, the alliance. Again, that concern that poor Black and poor Red, in this instance, people would ally themselves against the white power structure, was an ever-present concern. You see, as the value of cotton would continue to grow, it would ultimately become the most valuable commodity in the world, the most highly traded commodity in the world. The value of enslaved men, women, and children would increase, such that you have a domestic slave trade. More than 1 million men, women, and children moved from the Mid-South to the Lower South to feed that cotton demand. And we focused then in class 6 and 7 on the expansion of the trade. Then last class, we concluded our exploration into not simply the expansion of slavery, but the role that enslaved men, women, and children played in building that economy, and the extraordinarily high rates of productivity and efficiency gained, is demonstrated by Ed Baptiste in his great book, The Half Has Never Been Told. We took some time in class 7 to explore indigenous slavery in America, looking at the great book by Andres Resendez, The Other Slavery, and the reality, in fact, that enslaved indigenous people suffered terribly all throughout this period, and that indeed in the Southeast there were indigenous enslavers in some of the larger Southeastern tribes. We looked at the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of those Indian tribes, making space, more room for the cotton expansion. As historians have said, if the removal had not occurred, could not have been the great increase in productivity of the so that removal was critical, again, to continuing building wealth in the hands of the enslavers. We did a quick review in class 7 of the timeline to war, and this is where we find ourselves here in class 8. And so as we start again, we said we'd spend this time on the decade 1850 to 1860, the enslaved and the Civil War. Really want to focus on how enslaved people anticipated the potential of freedom with the apparent oncoming of this conflict between the North and the South. We're going to focus on a couple of key events that happen in this 1850 to 1860 period. The Compromise of 1850 and the fugitive slave law that would be so impactful, creates such anger in the North that would really fuel the oncoming war. We'll look at Lincoln's role, obviously critical, and his political genius in trying to maneuver both to keep the Union together, save the Union, and his address to the enslaved as an outcome, as a potential outcome. And then we'll look again, as we've said, really focusing on the role that enslaved themselves played. Frederick Douglass was and is recognized as a force both before the war, after the war. The recent biography of David Blight has brought even more clarity to our understanding of the importance that Douglass would play. And he was, again, born a slave, would not know his mother other than on a couple of occasions, raised by his grandparents. But at an early age, he determined that he was going to be free. His famous conflict he had with his enslaver, a well-reported fight. He's going to make his first attempt very early. I think he's about the age of 20. He's going to fail and be re-enslaved, and it wouldn't be until 1838 that he'd make his escape, finding himself in New York and then ultimately into New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he's going to marry his first wife and begin building this reputation and this life as a great speaker and a very, very important person in the anti-slavery abolition movement. Self-educated, constantly reading, would ultimately get to know personally William Lord Garrison, whose Liberator was one of his sources of information. He's going to be enlisted by Garrison to be a speaker, and over time they will become great colleagues. Over time, still, they're going to part ways over some strategies in the abolition movement. He'll publish his own North Star and again make his own path. As the war approaches, he becomes an increasingly important voice in the enlistment of Black men, critical of Lincoln in being slow to recruit Blacks. He's reported as having said, "This is not a time to fight with one hand when both hands are needed. This is no time to fight with only your white hand and allow your black hand to remain tied." So he's going to push and he's going to advocate and make his views known. He'll also say, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there's no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. Interestingly, Douglass will also become very closely aligned with the early women's suffrage movement and the women's abolitionist movements. He'll be, I believe, the only male speaker at the Seneca Falls, the 1848 famous convening of women suffragists. Let me play just a short clip. So this is a July 5th commemoration, 1852 commemoration of the Declaration of Independence. Douglass has been invited to speak to this group of mostly women. And he's, of course, well known for his speaking abilities. And again, they're here to celebrate the 4th of July. Douglass takes this opportunity to share with his audience his views of what the 4th of July means to the Negro. I'm going to just play a short clip. You should listen to the entire speech. This particular rendition is done by Ossie Davis, the great Black actor. I hope you know the name Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, his wife, who have passed now, but will live in our memories as two of the great actors of the 20th century. This is Ossie Davis and a short clip from What to the Slave.
To the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
So this is
Take the American slave
the
trade,
image,
which
as you can imagine. Douglas is invited to be the keynote speaker, and certainly he is well known. That's the reason for the invitation. But I can't but imagine, and this clip is simply not the crescendo, but all of the speech goes along this line. So there were probably some surprises in that audience with the veracity of his attack on really the hypocrisy of America celebrating liberty in the land of slavery. So do listen to all of this, and it's available on YouTube. And again, Douglas's rendition is superb. Let's talk about Dred Scott. I said this decade 1850 to 1860 is critical, and there are several events that will, I think, inevitably determine the path to war, and this is certainly one. The video here is a short clip. I'll skip it for purposes of our time. Make it available. You just understand this is a U.S. Supreme Court decision that again will drive the Northern abolitionists crazy and will give great hope to the Southern pro-slavery voices and forces. So Scott is born in about 1800. He is owned by Peter Blow, and Blow will take Dred Scott on travels, Virginia to Alabama, then to Missouri. Blow will die in Missouri in 1832, and Scott will be purchased by John Emerson, an Army surgeon, who will take him to the Illinois territories. Illinois and Wisconsin are those parts of the Louisiana Purchase. The territories, according to the 1820 Compromise, that were to be free, and slavery was to be prohibited. So Scott is now in Wisconsin. He will meet and marry his wife, Harriet. And he could have, at that point, again in the mid 1830s, sued for his freedom. Whether or not he realized it, whether or not he had sufficient education, it's unclear, but he does not sue until his master dies. Emerson is now in Louisiana. He will send for Dred Scott. Scott and his wife will come to Louisiana. And at this point, he realizes that he can sue, probably is in touch with some abolitionists, and he files suit. In 1847, he'll lose in a Missouri case. On the technicality, essentially, he's unable to identify his owner, the chain of custody, if you will, who owned him when. The Missouri Supreme Court will order a retrial, and in fact, in 1850, the St. Louis Circuit Court will rule that the Scotts are free. This is obviously great news for Dred Scott and his wife. Unfortunately, 2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court will reverse that decision. And at this point, Scott and his lawyers decide to proceed to the federal court. And they make the argument that because he is from one state and his alleged owner, purported owner, is from another, that there is federal jurisdiction. Chief Justice Taney will render the judgment in this very important case. And the tragedy here, so Taney is a Southerner, pro-slavery. By this point in his life, he'd freed all of his slaves, but he's still a strong supporter of slavery, and chooses to take the decision to write the decision in this case, where the associate justice originally assigned was leaning toward resolving the case in a simpler basis, and not making sort of the broad brush kind of decision that Taney would. So Taney, as the chief judge of the Supreme Court, will take this decision and will make a ruling that most lawyers, historians believe is the worst Supreme Court decision in our history. Again, Taney had the opportunity to allow this case to be resolved. The Supreme Court did not need to make the again, very, very expansive ruling that they do, but he essentially will rule that Blacks like Scott and his wife are not citizens and therefore have no right to sue. He will also make the very broad decision that would declare the 1820 Compromise unconstitutional. You recall, this is the compromise that would bring Maine and Missouri into as a free and slave state, and would bar or prohibit slavery being expanded into the territories. So in Chief Justice Taney's decision, that law is now unconstitutional, and enslavers celebrate as they can now extend slavery into the West. In his decision, Taney says, Negroes had not been part of the sovereign people who made the Constitution. They were not equal. They were not included, he says, in the all men whom the Declaration proclaimed created equal. After all, the author of that declaration and many of the signers owned slaves, Taney said, and for them to have regarded members of the enslaved race as potential citizens would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. For that matter, Taney would go on, at the time the Constitution was adopted, Negroes had for more than a century before been regarded as being of an inferior order, so far inferior that they had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. So here, again, the U.S. Supreme Court, under the pen of Chief Justice Roger Taney, would declare free people of color, enslaved people, not citizens, having no rights to which redress could be sought in the courts. A pivotal and again, decision of great import in this very, very troubling era, 1950 to 1960. A couple of other events here. Harriet Tubman, who is a name that should be familiar. If you've not seen the new Tubman movie, please do. But she will make her first escape during this era, and then would return to the South many times to help many others escape. So truly a hero, and would also become a spy for the Union Army, and would lead a successful campaign as a member of the Union forces during the war. So an incredible woman, incredible story. Let me show you a short clip on the Compromise. So we've dealt with the Compromise of 1820. The Compromise of 1850 is another one of these pivotal events that I think helps us explain how we get into this war.
In war, with the acquisition of territory in the West in an era of great sectional strife. This is right after the gold rush in California of 1849, and there's an awful lot of pressure over what to do about admitting a state in the West that doesn't have a history of slavery and might alter the sectional balance between slave and free states in the US Senate. And in January of 1850, a senator named Henry Clay, who's famous as a compromiser in American history, he offered a package of proposals to try to adjust the sectional debate between the country over this issue. And the debate in the Senate was fierce and intense, some of the most dramatic scenes in American history. And they turned over the architecture, the engineering of this compromise package to Stephen Douglas, a younger senator from Illinois, a Democrat. And Douglas decided that the only way to get enough support for all of the different elements of the compromise was to break it apart and treat it separately. When it achieved final form as a series of separate bills in the fall of 1860, there were only 5 bills. One was about the admission of California as a state, a free state. One was about the organization of the Southwest Territories, New Mexico and Utah, without regard to slavery. One was about the adjustment of the border with Texas and New Mexico. One was about the elimination of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And the 5th and final bill, and most important for Southerners, a tougher federal fugitive slave law. Afterwards, enough people were relieved that they felt like they had achieved a kind of compromise, but most historians realize it was a shaky one at best. And even though it appeared for a couple of years that it would succeed, very quickly the fabric of the so-called compromise of 1850 fell apart.
Young people in large numbers came out and
So we're
joined
going to
what became known as
examine,
the
get back to our slide, examine this in some detail. A couple of observations. You'll note the map that appeared behind the professor in the clip describing the Mexican accession. So this is the result of the U.S.-Mexican War, 1846 to 1848. The size of the U.S. will again double. America gaining the territory that's going to become California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. I mean, it's an enormous expansion. The fact is, he goes through the 5 elements, California being a free state. Well, Professor Resendez in his The Other Slavery, Andreas Resendez would say, yes, it formally was to be a free state, when in fact and in practice, the oligarchs, the wealthy planter patrons would indeed continue to enslave native peoples, Mexican peoples, for many, many years in various forms of unpaid labor. And so just let's always keep in the back of our minds that while the law might require something, those who control the law, as in the case of California in this period, slavery was still existent. The reference to the slave trade ending in DC is interesting in that many of those enslavers actually received payments for giving up their enslaved property, so paid reparations. But I want to really focus on this new fugitive slave law. Remember, in the Constitution, there is the fugitive slave clause that did not have enabling or enforcement language. The first attempt at a fugitive slave bill or law, 1889, I believe, also was ineffective in its language and just did not give the authorities the power. So enter the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and the creation of what's really the first federal police force. The law empowered commissioners to go wherever they chose, anywhere in the United States, and gave them great power to arrest and jail and bring to trial alleged runaway slaves. Many of these arrested, alleged enslaved people were in fact free people of color. The accused runaway was not given rights to speak at his or her trial, not given the benefit of counsel, and indeed these commissioners were empowered to enlist the assistance of anyone, local police authorities or citizens, in assisting in the capture of the alleged. So you have this whole mechanism built around the arrest and return to the slave states of those believed to be runaway, and there were hundreds of free people of color, never enslaved people, captured, kidnapped, and treated as a runaway slave. And what was interesting in the law, these commissioners in conducting their trials would be paid $10 for every runaway person who was determined to be a runaway and returned, and they would only receive $5 if the result of the so-called trial was that indeed the arrested person was indeed a free person. So an interesting, tragic, and another one of these, I say, events that is simply going to heighten the tension between the North and the South. And we see this played out in a couple of other short stories here. So John Andrew Jackson was indeed an escaped African American from South Carolina, 1847. He ends up in Salem, Massachusetts, keeps his name, publicly presents himself, speaks out about slavery, and he's doing this on sort of the abolitionist circuit, raising money, trying to free his family. But before he raises enough money, this new law is passed, and he has to leave Massachusetts because he's very well known, and obviously he's going to be targeted by these commissioners. So he flees Salem en route to Canada. Via the Underground Railroad, he encounters and indeed meets and will stay with Harriet Beecher Stowe at her home in Brunswick, Maine. While there, he will tell his story of life in slavery, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's biographer, Susanna Ashton, believes that it was the stories that Jackson tells Stowe that would make up the stories she will ultimately tell in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Interestingly, when Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe sometimes later during the war, he's alleged to have said, "So you are the little woman whose book started this war." So again, the Uncle Tom's Cabin, immensely important. Several different publications over the following its original publication in 1852, translated into several languages, really the first global bestseller. The other story I would tell is Anthony Burns, again, another formerly enslaved man from Virginia, escapes to Boston, is living in Boston and corresponding with his brother, who is still enslaved in Virginia. Unfortunately, one of his letters to his brother is intercepted by the enslaver, and the commissioners then proceed to Boston, and they arrest Burns. He's held by the federal authorities at the federal courthouse. And so in May of 1854, he's going to be tried by one of these commissioners. But the anti-slavery and abolition movements in Boston are up in arms, just outraged that one of their neighbors, in this case Anthony Burns, can be treated in this way. Interestingly, there are two. There is a black group of abolitionists meeting at the same time. There's a white group of abolitionists. I've said before that being a white abolitionist doesn't necessarily mean that you are also pro black or able to see black people as equal. So you have this this tension. The two groups do finally coalesce and meet, converge on the courthouse with the intent to break Anthony Burns out of federal custody. There is a police officer who is fatally wounded in that exchange, and Burns is kept in jail. Despite the obvious opposition from Boston citizens, federal authorities, including the president, who is determined to prove to to the Southern legislatures, Southerners from Congress, that this law can work, and that indeed runaways are going to be returned to their owners. So they insist that Burns is returned. He's declared a fugitive slave after the mock trial that they hold, and federal soldiers would come and collect Burns and return him to Virginia. After the judgment, reportedly 50,000 Bostonians will line the streets of Boston to watch as he's marched in shackles to a vessel waiting to be returned. It's reported obviously widely, not just in Boston, but all over the North. One of the Massachusetts natives in attendance is reported to have said, "We went to bed one night, old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and waked up stark mad abolitionists." So again, you have this growing energy by the North against the pro-slavers in the South, and that's going to lead ultimately again to the clash we know as the Civil War. Sojourner Truth. Abraham Lincoln referred to her as anti-truth. Perhaps the best known woman abolitionist of the era, happened to be a formerly enslaved woman, self-educated, but a powerful voice for Black freedom, for women's suffrage. She successfully covers the line between anti-slavery and the early women's suffrage movement. She will give a speech actually at a women's suffragist movement, and give a really, really well-known speech called "Ain't I a Woman?" This is a rendition of that speech by American actress Cicely Tyson. "Ain't I a Woman?"
Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think between the women of the North and the Negroes of the South, all thinking about rights, you white men gonna be in a fix pretty soon. Well, what's all this talking about? This man over there, yes, he said women have to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Well, nobody ever helped me in no carriage, over no mud puddles, or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arms. I done plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. Ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head, but I'm not going there yet, because I want to tell you that I done birthed 13 children and saw them most all sold out to slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me, and ain't that a woman? Then they talks about this thing in the head. What's that they call it? They call it intellect. Intellect, that's it, sugar. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup don't hold but a pint and yours hold a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half a pint? Huh? Then, this man in the black, yes, 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 he says, women's can't have as much rights as men's because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where your Christ come from? Where your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man didn't have nothing to do with it. If the first woman God ever made was able to take this world and turn it upside down, all these women's hair together ought to be able to get it back and turn it right up again. And now they's asking to do it. You men better let them. That's all I have to say. Much obliged for you listening to me. Thank you very much.
Again, this is Cecily Tyson's rendition of Ain't I a Woman, commemorating the congressional recognition of Sojourner Truth. I believe the statue of her is in Statuary Hall in Congress today. Extraordinary woman. So let's proceed. I said again, we're in a decade of great conflict and controversy. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is again one of these decisions, one of these plans put in place to find a way through the pro-slavery, anti-slavery tensions. And while it was well-intended, like the other efforts, it will not succeed. Let's take a listen to this TED Ed on Bleeding Kansas.
Today, when people complain about the state of American politics, they often mention the dominance of the Democratic and Republican parties, or the sharp split between red and blue states. But while it may seem like both of these things have been around forever, the situation looked quite different in 1850, with the Republican Party not yet existing, and support for the dominant Democrats and Whigs cutting across geographic divides. The collapse of this second party system was at the center of increasing regional tensions that would lead to the birth of the Republican Party, the rise of Abraham Lincoln as its leader, and a civil war that would claim over 500,000 lives. And if this collapse could be blamed on a single event, it would be the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The story starts with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. To balance the number of slave states and free states in the Union, it allowed slavery in the newly admitted state of Missouri, while making it off limits in the remaining federally administered Louisiana Territory. But compromises tend to last only as long as they're convenient, and by the early 1850s, a tenacious Democratic senator from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas found its terms very inconvenient. As an advocate of Western expansion, he promoted constructing a transcontinental railroad across the Northern Plains with an eastern terminus in Chicago, where he happened to own real estate. For his proposal to succeed, Douglas felt that the territories through which the railroad passed would have to be formally organized, which required the support of Southern politicians. He was also a believer in popular sovereignty, arguing that the status of slavery in a territory should be decided by its residents rather than Congress. So Douglas introduced a bill designed to kill two birds with one stone. It would divide the large chunk of incorporated land into two new organized territories, Nebraska and Kansas, each of which would be open to slavery if the population voted to allow it. While Douglas and his Southern supporters tried to frame the bill as protecting the political rights of settlers, horrified Northerners recognized it as repealing the 34-year-old Missouri Compromise and feared that its supporters' ultimate goal was to extend slavery to the entire nation. Congress was able to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but at the huge cost of bitterly dividing the nation, with 91% of the opposition coming from Northerners. In the House of Representatives, politicians traded insults and brandished weapons until a sergeant at arms restored order. President Pierce signed the bill into law amidst a storm of protest, while Georgia's Alexander Stephens, future Confederate vice president, hailed the act's passage as glory enough for one day. The New York Tribune reported, "The unanimous sentiment of the North is indignant resistance." Douglas even admitted that he could travel from Washington, D.C. to Chicago by the light of his own burning effigies. The political consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act were stunning. Previously, both Whigs and Democrats had included Northern and Southern lawmakers united around various issues. But now slavery became a dividing factor that could not be ignored. congressmen from both parties spoke out against the act, including an Illinois Whig named Abraham Lincoln, denouncing the monstrous injustice of slavery in an 1854 speech. By this time, the Whigs had all but ceased to exist, irreparably split between their northern and southern factions. In the same year, the new Republican Party was founded by the anti-slavery elements from both existing parties. Although Lincoln still ran for Senate as a Whig in 1854, he was an early supporter of the new party and helped to recruit others to its cause. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was shaken when events in the newly formed Kansas Territory revealed the violent consequences of popular sovereignty. Advertisements appeared across the North, imploring people to emigrate to Kansas to stem the advance of slavery. The South answered with border ruffians, pro-slavery Missourians who crossed state lines to vote in fraudulent elections and raid anti-slavery settlements. One Northern abolitionist, John Brown, became notorious following the Potawatomi Massacre of 1856, when he and his sons hacked to death 5 pro-slavery farmers with broadswords. In the end, more than 50 people died in Bleeding, Kansas. While nominally still a national party, Douglas's Democrats were increasingly divided along sectional lines, and many Northern members left to join the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln finally took up the Republican Party banner in 1856 and never looked back. That year, John C. Fremont, the first Republican presidential candidate, lost to Democrat James Buchanan, but garnered 33% of the popular vote, all from northern states. 2 years later, Lincoln challenged Douglas for his Illinois Senate seat, and although he lost that contest, it elevated his status among Republicans. Lincoln would finally be vindicated in 1860 when he was elected President of the United States, defeating in his own home state a certain Northern Democrat who was finally undone by the disastrous aftermath of the law he had masterminded. Americans today continue to debate whether the Civil War was inevitable, but there is no doubt that the Kansas-Nebraska Act made the ghastly conflict much more likely. And for that reason, it should be remembered as one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history.
We could probably argue that indeed the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the bloodshed that followed Bleeding Kansas was the first blood shed in the Civil War. The reference, of course, to John Brown, well-known episode, and of course Brown's going to gain greater fame with his attack on Harper's Ferry in two years hence, 1858. Other bloodshed was taking place, not only the destruction of the then existing political structure, the Whigs now becoming the Republicans, and the rift between the Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. But there's another episode. He mentioned politicians drawing weapons. In May of 1856, a U.S. Senator, Charles Sumner, will be attacked on the floor of the U.S. Senate by Preston Brooks, a South Carolina senator, I believe, who will attack Sumner while seated at his desk in the Senate with a cane and nearly kill him. Fortunately, Sumner will survive and will go on to play a pivotal role in the post-war, the Reconstruction era, as one of the radical Republicans who will drive toward passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment and other provisions in Reconstruction that will be critically important to the rise of Black political power during the era that we call Reconstruction. So again, this is one of several events happening in what I've called this decade of conflict that will invariably lead to the U.S. Civil War. The Margaret Garner case is a tragic one. Let me just take a moment. You may be familiar with Toni Morrison's Beloved, her book, from which a movie also has been made. I think Oprah Winfrey's movie Beloved. Garner tells the story of an enslaved woman and her family who escape across the Ohio River. They make it into the Free State. only to be confronted by the slave catchers. Recognizing the potential return to slavery, Garner instead will slit the throats of 2 of her children. And instead of standing trial for those attacks, she's going to be returned to her enslaver in the South. She has a child in arms, and on the riverboat ride back home, she'll allow the youngest child to slip from her arms into the river to her death, making a clear statement that while she was born and raised in slavery, she was not going to have her children suffer the same fate. Obviously, this case would garner great attention all across the nation, with, as you can imagine, very different views depending upon where your opinion lies on the pro-slavery, anti-slavery argument. But it was this kind of notoriety and this kind of information was driving public opinion and viewpoints in this decade before, period before the Civil War. Let me pause here. Let's take some questions, and then we'll get into that era just before the war. John Brown, again, we saw him in the Kansas-Nebraska Bleeding Kansas video. There's been a recent work, Showtime publication, The Good Lord Bird. And it was a depiction of this era, and particularly John Brown and his efforts to foment a revolt of enslaved peoples to rise up, which of course led Brown to his end at Harper's Ferry. Let's take a quick look at this clip.
He stands up without notes and gives one of the greatest speeches in American history. Brown, in simple, direct, powerful language, basically put his accusers on trial.
Had I interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, I submit.
Shields Green and the other captives had already been sentenced to hang. There could be little doubt that Brown would follow them. From his jail cell, Brown kept up a stream of correspondence and interviews which were breathlessly reported throughout the North.
This guy's just led a raid to destroy slavery. They've killed people, and not the first people he's killed, and he's suddenly become famously depicted in art wearing these sort of evening slippers with this long, peaceful old patriarch beard, and he's the abolitionist grandfather you wish you had.
Brown was absolutely a genius at working the press, at giving interviews, at talking to people, and turning himself into as fully committed a Christian sacrificial lamb on the altar of slavery as he could possibly be.
You have the Northern establishment, every newspaper saying, this guy's a hero, he's a saint. How can Southerners look at that and say, oh, these guys are good negotiating partners, we're going to be able to sort the slavery problem out?
What Brown has done ultimately is just to expose the depth of the divide between North and South. And after that point, that divide can never be bridged.
So, and again, this comes just months before the beginning of the war. Lincoln's election in 1860, which we'll get to in a moment, but Brown, as depicted in the video, is really the last straw. and the very strong support for him in the North, the very strong opposition of him in the South, perhaps best characterizes the tensions that were going to again lead to that war. So let's talk about Lincoln, an incredible political actor. Some would argue our greatest president. Debate about Lincoln's attitudes toward slavery, attitudes toward Black people, will forever be fought. But objectively, our country would not be where we are or who we are today, but for his appearance on the scene at this pivotal time. Again, I've said in setting up this stage, we're talking about a decade of conflict that simply reached its height with his election in 1860. The clip that I'll share addresses this question of his certainty about emancipation. I think that today most historians would say has been resolved, but I raise it nonetheless. When we watch it and think about Lincoln, we have to never lose sight of the fact that he avoided characterizing the war as being a war against slavery, and he did that not because he was pro or anti-slavery. He said very early in his life he'd always hated slavery. He avoided characterizing this as a war against slavery because he knew the North would not go to war to free the slaves. He knew the level of anti-Black hate and racism that existed in the North. Indeed, he would challenge his Black collaborators and associates with both his and their awareness of the depth of anger, of dislike by most whites toward people of color, and therefore he knew the war couldn't be waged on that basis. He also was very clear that he did not believe he had the constitutional authority to alter or impact slavery where it currently existed. And he was a constitutionalist and understood the importance of fighting this war on the strength of the Constitution and its requirements, and not to press that issue. He confronted great challenges as the war began, because as it became clear from day one, Black people were watching the developments and were responding to opportunities and were running away by the thousands and running into the Union lines and presenting a great challenge for the Union general. A couple of examples. August 1861, General John C. Fremont, in charge of the Army of the Missouri at that point, will issue a declaration freeing all of the slaves who have run to his lines. Lincoln is outraged to hear this because, again, it goes against his war strategy, his political calculations, and has to fire Fremont when he refuses to rescind that proclamation. General David Hunter will issue a similar proclamation covering Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida about the same time as Fremont's. He will adhere to Lincoln's demand that it be rescinded. Interestingly, General Benjamin Butler will take a more politically astute tack with his army in Virginia and declare that the enslaved people who run to his lines at Fort Monroe are contrabands of war. And this is really a brilliant move on his part, and one that Lincoln will endorse, recognizing that contraband is a classic military tactic. You take the material property of your enemy where you can to weaken that enemy, and taking enslaved people who happen to make their way to the Union lines as contraband Lincoln recognizes even earlier on the extent to which enslaved people are running off plantations, are not available then either to help provide the material and supply and food to the enemy at this point, and not available to be used by the Confederate Army in the building of battlements and entrenchments, is again strategically, tactically going to benefit the Union Army. Congress will agree. August 6th, 1861, they will pass the first Confiscation Act, which would authorize the Union to seize rebel property. Again, contraband confiscation, and granted to all enslaved who fought or worked for the Confederate that they would be free from their obligation. This isn't an Emancipation Proclamation, but it's close. Congress will follow that in July 1862 with a second Confiscation Act that said that the enslaved of civilian or military Confederate officials were and shall be forever free. So this comes as close to an proclamation of emancipation as you get, but these are two congressional acts confiscating, again, the property of the Confederacy. Lastly, then in 1862, July, Congress will pass the Militia Act, which will, at this point, permit Lincoln and the Union to recruit Black troops, which will become increasingly critical to the war effort in 1863 to the end of the war. Lincoln's going to meet with a group of Black clergy in August of 1862, and interestingly, we'll get into a debate with them over, as Lincoln would advocate colonization. He's recognizing that once the war ends, we're going to have an issue with formerly enslaved people now freed under his proclamation, ultimately by the 13th Amendment. And what are we going to do with all of these free Black people now living amongst all of these white people, whether North and South? Lincoln believes that all that he can do is try and find a different place, a different home for African Americans, and these clergy will challenge Lincoln and refuse to go along with his thinking here. Let's show this quick piece on Emancipation Proclamation, and we'll conclude.
On the 22nd of September, 1862, the newspapers brought astonishing news. Lincoln was promising to sign an Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day. All persons, Lincoln wrote, held as slaves within any state in rebellion shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation was the first sign that the president was moving by agonizing steps to a new understanding of the war. For Lincoln, the carnage had become unendurable unless it could be given over to a higher purpose. Still, Garrison was wary. Lincoln seemed to be hedging. In December of 1862, only weeks before the promised date, Lincoln presented Congress with a dramatic peace plan. If the Southern states would lay down their arms, they could keep their slaves for another 40 years. Abolitionists were baffled. In the space of 5 months, the president had declared that the war wasn't about slavery, suggested that all Black people should leave the United States, promised to emancipate the slaves on January 1st, and finally offered to let Southerners keep their slaves until 1900. Garrison, Douglas, and every other abolitionist had good reason to wonder whether Lincoln would ever sign the Emancipation Proclamation.
One can understand the concern of the abolitionists, certainly the anti-slavery voices like Garrison and Douglas. Lincoln, I think biographers would say, was simply trying to find a path forward to save the Union. We'll see in a moment that he was always very clear about his goal. This peace plan offered after floating the idea of an Emancipation Proclamation is particularly trouble. Imagine had that passed and slavery continued to the 1900s. Just a very, very troubling concept, but again, Lincoln being the master politician would float ideas like this among Black audiences, white audiences, certainly the politicians that were listening and engaged with him. We know that the Emancipation, January 1863, would in fact be passed or signed by Lincoln, and understand that it was not a document freeing all enslaved people in the United States. It freed all those enslaved people who were currently living in areas under the control of the Confederacy. So it was a limited emancipation. And there were specific exceptions. The border states, for example, were accepted. They were slaveholding. They're still supporting the Union, and Lincoln wanted to ensure that would continue. So Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, West Virginia had not seceded, and Lincoln was insistent that they stay within the Union. And he did not want to free the slaves in those states for fear that they would go over to the Confederacy, which would have certainly tilted the balance of power in favor of the Confederacy. So this was a political document. It was a military document. And people, again, therefore, question Lincoln's motives and whether or not he was truly the liberator of Black people. Lincoln would be the first to tell you that in most instances, Black people liberated themselves. Go back to what we said earlier about the hundreds of thousands of Black people who escaped into the Union lines, the almost 200,000 Black men who would fight for the Union at a time when it was critical and needed because they didn't have enough white troops to fight for. So Black people fought and gained their freedom. Lincoln's emancipation was an important step in that direction and was important to saving the Union, which was his goal. Lastly, as we question Lincoln's thinking and his motives, he could simply have entitled this order a general order, an executive order, an order concerning enslaved people in possessions owned and controlled by the Confederate. He chose this name as the Emancipation Proclamation. And again, another brilliant political strategic move on his part, because he's sending a message that indeed, while this has limited reach, it is indeed a document of emancipation. And it was read that way, understood that way by Black people, and encouraged even more Black people to take their freedom by running into the Union lines. Lincoln, again, as I said before, was always clear. There's a famous correspondence between himself and Horace Greeley. Greeley's challenging him in August of '62 to abolish slavery. And Lincoln's reply is simply and in short, and in part, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that. He was going to do whatever it took to save the Union. And what he did for enslaved people, he did to save the Union. So as we conclude, I thought I'll share some insight from W.E.B. Du Bois, a brilliant Black scholar of the 18th and 19th and 20th century, I should say, whose Black Reconstruction, published in 1938, I believe, is the seminal work on Reconstruction Eric Foner's more contemporary work was built on the work that Du Bois began in his Black Reconstruction, and it was the scholarship that would present the first and greatest challenge to the lost cause ideologies of the Dunning School. We don't have time to expand much on that, but Du Bois is perhaps certainly the leading scholar of the time, and even today is of great importance to our understanding of American history. A bit of his background here: first awarded Harvard PhD, and one of the founders of the NAACP, publisher of The Crisis, the organization's journal for many years. So phenomenally important presence, and someone who, given his birth just a couple of years after the war, and his education at a time where he could still go to the South and speak to soldiers who had fought in the war, both Black and white, and gain a perspective is particularly interesting. So I wanted to share some of his insights. So here, taken from Black Reconstruction, is the full statement of Lincoln. I referenced a part of it earlier. He says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union." And he concludes by saying, "What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it would help to save the Union." Always focused on the Union. If all of the enslaved people, which would ultimately be the case, could be freed, so be it. But he was also willing, as we've seen, to negotiate a peace treaty that might have extended slavery to the beginning of the 20th century. A shocking idea. Du Bois also shares what did the war mean to the enslaved? What did the enslaved mean to the war? And he says, what the Negro did was to wait and look and listen and try to see where his interests lay. There was no use in seeking refuge in an army which was not an army of freedom, and there was no sense in revolting against armed masters who were conquering the world. So Black folks understand there's a war, understand there's an opportunity, and they were alert to take advantage of those opportunities, which they did in great numbers, as I've said throughout the lecture. There was great risk. Understand that armies succeed, armies fail, and as the North would take land, take possession of areas, they might also lose that in a counterattack. And so enslaved people looking to take advantage had to be careful that today's success might be tomorrow's failure. And certainly they knew that the retribution, having sided with the enemy, would be devastating to them and their families. He goes on to say, as soon as it became clear that the Union armies would not or could not return fugitive slaves, and that the masters, with all their fume and fury, were uncertain of victory, the slave entered upon a general strike. This is his term. Again, Marxist economic perspective of Du Bois, calling this a general strike against slavery, by the same methods that he had used during the period of the fugitive slave. He ran away to the first place of safety and offered his services to the Federal Army, so that in this way it was really true that he served his former masters and served the Emancipation Army. And it was also true that this withdrawal and bestowal of labor decided the war. No question in Du Bois's view, or mine for that matter, and I think in the view of many historians, that it was the involvement of the formerly enslaved, escaped to the lines, and then many of whom would become soldiers for the Union, that would decide the war. How did Lincoln's views of the war change over time? He was dubious, as most military leaders were, that in fact, if we recruit Black troops to fight the rebels, the arms that are given might end up in the hands of their former enslavers. And this is 1862, Lincoln in a speech to Chicago Protestants. His views would change. As he says here, under a fire of criticism, Lincoln warmly defended the enlistment of Negro troops. He said, "The slightest knowledge of arithmetic will prove to any man that the rebel armies cannot be destroyed with democratic strategy. It would sacrifice all the white men of the North to do it. There are now in the service of the United States near 200,000 able-bodied colored men, most of them under arms, defending and acquiring Union territory." He concludes by saying, "Abandon all the posts now garrisoned by black men. Take 200,000 men from our side and put them in the battlefield or cornfield against us, and we would be compelled to abandon the war in 3 weeks." Lincoln's become a believer in the recruitment and utilization of black troops, obviously. How did the North view the enslaved? So this is a reference to the 1863 draft law. You were conscripted into the Union Army. Once your conscription expired, you'd return home to the farm. It's 1863. The war's going on for almost 3 years, and the War Department needed to institute a new draft. So there's a passage of the 1863 draft law. It says the establishment of the draft undertaken July 13th in New York City was met everywhere with resistance. The movement spread over the whole city. Mobs visited workshops and compelled the men to stop work. Firemen were prevented from putting out fires. Telegraph wires were cut. And then at the last, the whole force of the riot turned against the Negroes. They were the cause of the war and hence the cause of the draft. The report of the Merchants Committee on the draft riot says of the Negroes, driven by the fear of death at the hands of the mob, who the week previous had, as you remember, brutally murdered by hanging on trees and lampposts several of their number, and cruelly beaten and robbed many others, burning and sacking their houses, and driving nearly all from the streets, alleys, and docks. Property loss was put at $1.2 million, probably 20 million in today's dollars, and it was estimated that between 400 and 1,000 people were killed. So this was the North, and this was the racism that Lincoln was certainly aware of, and that most free people of color were aware of. In this particular instance, anti-Black violence perpetrated in retaliation for a Union military policy. How did the South view the enslaved? The most terrible case of Confederate cruelty was the massacre at Fort Pillow. When Major Booth refused to surrender the fort, the Confederate General Forrest gave a signal and his troops made a fierce charge. In 10 minutes, they had swept in. Federal troops surrendered, but an indiscriminate massacre followed. The Black troops were shot down in their tracks, pinioned to the ground with bayonets and saber. Some were clubbed to death while dying of wounds. Others were made to get down upon their knees, in which condition they were shot to death. Some were burned alive, having been fastened inside the buildings, while still others were nailed against the houses, tortured, and then burned to a crisp. This is Du Bois's report of Fort Pillow. A horrendous massacre, anti-Black terrorism by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who would go on after the war to become the first Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. Black troops, once learning about the massacre at Fort Pillow, would forever, until the end of the war, go into battle, charging, remember Fort Pillow. How did the enslaved perform as soldiers? And this is Du Bois's, again, his history as he's gathered it for Black Reconstruction. He says the conduct of the colored troops, by the way, in the actions of the last few days is described as superb. An Ohio soldier said to me today, "I've never saw men fight with such desperate gallantry as those Negroes did. They advanced as grim and stern as death, and when within reach of the enemy, struck about them with pitiless vigor that was almost fearful." Official figures say that there were in all 186,017 Negro troops, of whom 123,156 were still in service at the end of the war, and that the losses during the war were 68, almost 70,000. They took part in 198 battles and skirmishes, without doubt including servants, laborers, and spies, between 300,000 and 400,000 Negroes helped as regular soldiers or laborers in winning the Civil War. Not only did Negroes fight in the ranks, but also 75 served as commissioned officers and a large number as subalterns. Medals of honor were bestowed by the US government for heroic conduct on the field of battle upon 14 Negroes. Again, a estimable compliment. This is information gathered by W.E.B. Du Bois about the contribution to the end of the war, to the winning of the war by Black troops. So, a couple of clips here on the Civil War specifically, which I'll include and is available to you. We've talked about the Emancipation and ultimately the 13th Amendment, which will be passed in 1865, abolishing slavery in the United States and putting an end to the internet, what had been the international slave trade for three centuries before. As I conclude, I want us again to focus as we think about these 8 classes: racism, resistance, and reflection. Now, I've said from the beginning that you can't understand American slavery without understanding the racist underpinnings that supported it for the 2.5 centuries. The resistance that Black men, women, and children presented at every opportunity, ultimately leading again to the end of the Civil War and freedom for all, the passage of the 13th Amendment, and simply reflecting again on how critical it is as we think about our world today, think about the challenges that we face as a people still struggling with the legacy and aftermath of slavery, and understanding how our ability to overcome sort of the mentality that would have legalized the mistreatment of human beings for this long period of time needs to be reconciled if we're to really understand where we are today and why we continue to have the problems that we do. I always like to end my lectures on American slavery by sharing a letter. This is called "To My Old Master," and it is Jordan Anderson, a formerly enslaved man who is now free, but has received a letter from his former master, who is asking him to return to Tennessee and to work for what his master, Colonel Anderson, describes as a better opportunity. So this is Jordan writing to his old master, and dated August 7th, 1865, Dayton, Ohio, to my old master, Colonel P.H. Anderson, Big Spring, Tennessee. Sir, Jordan begins, I got your letter and was glad to find that you had not forgotten Jordan and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else can. He says, I have often felt uneasy about you. I thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this for harboring Rebs they found at your house. I suppose they never heard about your going to Colonel Martin's to kill the Union soldier that was left by his company in their stable. Although you shot at me twice before I left, I did not want to hear of your being hurt and am glad you are still living. It would do me good to go back to the dear old home again and see Miss Mary and Miss Martha and Alan, Esther, Green, and Lee. Give my love to them all and tell them I hope we will meet in the better world, if not in this. I would have come back to see you all when I was working in the Nashville hospital, but one of the neighbors told me that Henry intended to shoot me if he ever got a chance. I want to know particularly what the good chance is you propose to give me. Jordan says, I'm doing tolerably well here. I get $25 a month with victuals and clothing, have a comfortable home with Mandy, the folks calls her Ms. Anderson, and the children, Millie, Jane, and Grundy, go to school and are learning well. The teacher says Grundy has a head for a preacher. They go to Sunday school, and Mandy and me attend church regularly. We are kindly treated. Sometimes we overhear others saying, them colored people were slaves down in Tennessee. The children feel hurt when they hear such remarks, but I tell them it was no disgrace in Tennessee to belong to Colonel Anderson. Many darkies would have been proud, as I used to be, to call you master. Now, if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it would be to my advantage to move back again. As to my freedom, which you say I can have, there is nothing to be gained on that score, as I got my free papers in 1864 from the Provost Marshal General in the Department of Nashville. Mandy says she would be afraid to go back without some proof that you were disposed to treat us justly and kindly. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. This will make us forget and forgive old scores and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years and Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me, and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express in care of V. Winters, Esquire, Dayton, Ohio. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we can have little faith in your promises in the future. We trust the good Maker has opened your eyes to the wrongs which you and your fathers have done to me and my fathers in making us toil for you for generations without recompense. Here I draw my wages every Saturday night, but in Tennessee, there was never any payday for the Negroes any more than for the horses and cows. Surely there will be a day of reckoning for those who defraud the laborer of his hire. In answering this letter, please state if there would be any safety for my Millie and Jane, who are now grown up and both good-looking girls. You know how it was with poor Matilda and Catherine. I would rather stay here and starve and die. If it come to that, then have my girls brought to shame by the violence and wickedness of their young masters. You will also please state if there has been any schools open for the colored children in your neighborhood. The great desire of my life now is to give my children an education and have them form virtuous habits. Say howdy to George Carter and thank him for taking the pistol from you when you were shooting at me. From your old servant, Jordan Anderson. One of the earliest claims for reparations, I would argue. Thank you again for joining us for these classes. My contact information is available on the link, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that remain. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.